14.3 seconds. That was the duration between hull breach and full atmospheric evacuation in Sector 7 Ghana during the third engagement over Zirconia's belt. I know because I was monitoring pressure sensors when it happened. The data streamed directly into my cogitator array, 147 souls present in that section when the macro shell punched through. 109 remained by the time the emergency bulkheads completed their cycle. I archived the exact figure. The system logged every biosign that terminated in that interval. I watched the numbers decrease in real time, green indicators shifting to red, then to nothing at all. The others, 38 men, were sealed on the wrong side of the barrier. I need to establish context. I was not always integrated into the ship's systems. There was a period before when I existed as a separate biological unit, with designation and purpose external to the vessel itself. I remember. No, I access archived sensory data from that time. The distinction matters. Memory implies continuity of self. I process historical records of a person who shared my biological origin point, but who no longer exists in any meaningful operational capacity. That person was born on a forge world, not one of the great manufacturing centers that produce titans and warships, but a secondary facility dedicated to component fabrication. Small parts, millions of them daily. My family unit, I retain the term though it carries no emotional weight now, operated a sorting mechanism in sublevel 41. The temperature there remained constant at 37.8 degrees Celsius. I know this because the heat was the first thing I noticed every morning when we descended into the work chambers. Not hot enough to impair function, but warm enough that moisture accumulated on metal surfaces. Everything was damp. The railings, the tool handles, the floor plating beneath our feet as we moved between stations. Your hands were always slightly wet when you worked there. And the moisture carried the taste of recycled coolant and machine oil. A metallic tang that settled on your tongue and stayed there throughout the shift, no matter how much water you drank. My father worked the primary sorting mechanism. My mother handled quality inspection for rejected components. I was assigned to secondary sorting, the smaller parts that required finer motor control. I was good at it, fast and accurate. My error rate was 0.37%, well below the acceptable threshold of 2%. The shift supervisors noted this. They said I had potential for advancement if I maintained consistent performance. I maintained it for 2 years before the assessors came. I was 16 standard years when the Munitorum assessors arrived. They came every 3 cycles to review production quotas and extract suitable candidates for service. I remember standing in the processing line. I remember. The memory is intact, uncorrupted, still accessible. The assessor was an older man with augmetic eyes that clicked when he focused. A small mechanical sound, like a relay closing. He examined each of us for approximately 40 seconds, recording data on a handheld slate with quick, efficient movements. When he reached me, he spent an additional 12 seconds reviewing something on the slate screen. His augmetic eyes clicked 3 times in rapid succession. Then he marked something and moved on without comment. My father told me later that being selected was an honor. He used that specific word, honor. I noted it for the record, though I had no framework at that time to evaluate the statement's accuracy. My mother said nothing, but I observed her hands shaking slightly as she prepared the evening meal. That was unusual. Her hands were always steady. Quality inspection required precision. I logged the observation but did not understand its significance until much later, when I had accumulated enough data about Imperial service to recognize what my parents had understood immediately. That I would not return. 3 days after the assessment, I boarded a transport with 47 other selected candidates. The departure facility was located in the upper levels of the forge complex, an area I had never accessed before. The corridors there were wider, better lit, marked with imperial aquilas and mechanicus sigils that indicated official administrative space. My parents were not permitted to accompany me beyond the initial security checkpoint. My father gripped my shoulder briefly. My mother's hands were still shaking. Then they were escorted back to the work levels, and I proceeded with the other candidates to the transport bay. I never saw my family unit again. I do not experience distress about this. I simply note it as a data point in the sequence of events that led to my current operational state. But I retain, archived, not remembered, the image of my mother's hands shaking as she had prepared that final meal we shared. That specific detail persists in storage with unusual clarity. I access it sometimes when my monitoring duties enter low-activity periods and I have excess cognitive capacity. I do not know why I allocated permanent storage to that particular image. It serves no operational purpose. Perhaps it serves as calibration, a reference point for what human connection looked like before augmentation restructured my capacity to process such things. The transport took us to a naval facility, orbiting a world I was never given clearance to identify. The journey lasted 11 days. We were confined to a cargo hold that had been converted to temporary crew quarters, 60 bunks stacked 3 high, minimal facilities, recycled air that tasted flat and stale. Most of the other candidates were frightened. I observed this through their behavior patterns. Reduced food consumption, disrupted sleep cycles, excessive verbal communication focused on speculation about our destination and purpose. Some cried during the night cycles when they thought others were sleeping. I did not participate in these displays. I had been selected for a reason. The Imperium's mechanisms were vast and complex, but they operated according to logic and necessity. Wherever we were being transported, whatever function we would serve, it would be appropriate to our assessed capabilities. This was naive, but I did not yet understand the Imperium's actual operational logic. I did not yet understand that appropriate meant optimal resource utilization, not individual consideration. The facility processed recruits for technical specialization, individuals assessed as suitable for cogitator integration, advanced systems monitoring, or direct augmentation for shipboard service. We underwent 3 weeks of continuous evaluation, cognitive testing, physical examination, psychological profiling, aptitude assessment across dozens of specific skill categories. The evaluations occurred in cycles that ignored standard circadian rhythms. You slept when they told you to sleep. You woke when the lights activated. You performed the required tasks regardless of fatigue state. This was intentional, I learned later. They were measuring not just baseline capability, but performance degradation under stress, ability to maintain function despite physiological deprivation. I scored highest in the intake cohort for pattern recognition and sustained attention span. The administrator who delivered my evaluation results was a thin woman with extensive facial augmentation that made her expression difficult to read. She informed me I would be trained as a systems monitor for deep space vessels. She said I should feel proud, that this was a position of significant responsibility, that the Imperium relied on individuals like me to maintain the infrastructure that kept humanity's fleets operational across the vast distances of the void. I filed the statement without emotional response. Pride was not something I had adequate reference for. I understood accomplishment in terms of meeting performance standards. I had met the standards. That was sufficient. She continued speaking. She explained that the training would be intensive, that many candidates failed to complete the program, that those who succeeded would be augmented to enhance their capabilities and assigned to vessels operating in combat zones across the Imperium. She said the service would be demanding but vital, that every system I would monitor, every anomaly I would detect, every failure I would identify before it became catastrophic, all of it would save lives and preserve the Emperor's ships. I noted her words carefully. Saved lives, preserved ships, these seemed like meaningful outcomes, purposes that would justify the intensive training and augmentation she had described. I did not yet understand that preservation and salvation were statistical concepts, that my function would be to minimize casualties, not prevent them, that some losses were always acceptable if they prevented greater losses. That distinction would become clear much later. Training lasted 2 years, 4 months, and 17 days. They taught us how to interface with ship systems, how to read the constant data streams that flowed through a vessel's neural architecture, how to identify anomalies in pressure, temperature, radiation, chemical composition, power distribution, and 100 other variables that kept a warship functional in the void. They taught us that hesitation killed crews, that information had to be processed instantly, and decisions made without the delay that emotional response introduced. They were very clear about this point. They repeated it in every briefing, every simulation, every evaluation session. Emotional response introduces lag time. Lag time produces suboptimal outcomes. Suboptimal outcomes in void operations mean death. The principle was simple. You could feel things, or you could save people. You could not do both. The training simulations were comprehensive. We worked in mock monitoring stations identical to those aboard active vessels. The instructors would introduce system failures, pressure breaches, plasma conduit ruptures, generatorium fluctuations, coolant leaks, structural stress fractures, and we had to identify the problem, calculate the optimal response, and execute the required emergency protocols within specified time windows. The simulations increased in complexity as we progressed. Multiple simultaneous failures, cascading system collapses, combat damage scenarios where hull breaches and equipment failures occurred in rapid succession while you tried to maintain operational awareness across dozens of ship sections. Failure meant repetition. You ran the simulation again until you achieved acceptable performance. Some candidates ran the same scenarios dozens of times, struggling to process the information load or execute responses quickly enough. Others washed out entirely, reassigned to less demanding positions when it became clear they could not develop the required capabilities. I excelled. I do not state this as pride. I state it as documented fact preserved in my service record. My processing speed exceeded standard parameters by 17%. My error rate fell below acceptable thresholds by the 3rd month and continued to decrease throughout training. By the end of the program, I could monitor 43 separate data streams simultaneously and identify critical failures within 0.6 seconds of initial indicator variance. The instructors noted my performance in their evaluations. One of them, I no longer have his name archived, but I remember his face, had burn scarring across the left side, probably from plasma exposure during his own service, told me I had natural aptitude for systems integration, that some recruits struggled to process multiple data streams without becoming overwhelmed. But I seemed to handle the information load as though it was my default cognitive state. He said this would serve me well once I was augmented and integrated into an actual ship's monitoring systems. He was correct, though not in the way he likely intended. The augmentation did not enhance my natural capabilities. It replaced them. What he had identified as aptitude was simply the ease with which I could be converted from person into component. They augmented me during the final month of training. Not extensively. I was not being prepared for Skitarii service or combat integration. The augmentation was purely functional. Neural interface ports installed at the base of my skull and along my spine. Cognitive enhancers to accelerate processing speed and improve working memory capacity. Chemical regulators to suppress unnecessary biological responses that degraded efficiency, specifically emotional reactions that consumed cognitive resources, and introduced decision-making lag. The procedure took 6 hours and 43 minutes. I was conscious for most of it. They said conscious integration produced better neural mapping, that the brain needed to be active during interface installation to establish proper connection protocols. I observed the process through a mounted mirror positioned above the surgical bay. They opened my skull with a molecular saw that made a high-pitched whining sound that continued throughout the procedure. I watched them peel back sections of my scalp and remove portions of skull bone to access the brain tissue beneath. The bone came away in curved sections that they placed carefully on a tray beside the surgical bay. Then they inserted the primary interface cluster, a web of silver filaments that spread across my brain's surface like metallic roots seeking purchase in organic soil. Each filament was thinner than human hair, but I could feel them penetrating the surface tissue, threading into the neural architecture beneath. It was interesting from a technical standpoint. The human brain is considerably more compact than schematic representations suggest, and the interface filaments were far more delicate than I had expected. Flexible and almost organic in how they moved as the technicians guided them into position. I felt pressure but not pain. They had administered localized numbing agents that blocked pain receptors while leaving other sensory input intact. I could feel the technician's hands moving inside my skull, could sense the insertion of foreign objects into my body, the slight tugging sensation as they anchored the filaments to specific neural clusters. But the sensations arrived stripped of the urgent quality that normally characterized such intrusions. Everything was distant, observational, as though happening to someone else whose experiences I was monitoring through remote sensors. That sensation, distance, observation, the feeling of experiencing events second-hand, never entirely went away after the procedure. It became my default state, the world arriving through filters that reduced everything to data before it reached whatever remained of my consciousness. Recovery took 3 weeks. The first week was difficult. The neural interfaces had to integrate with existing brain architecture, and the process produced what the Medicaid staff called integration dissonance. Sensory input became unreliable. Visual data sometimes arrived delayed or distorted, images appearing seconds after I had turned away from the source. Auditory information occasionally repeated or echoed, sounds playing multiple times or in incorrect sequence. Proprioceptive awareness, the sense of where your body was in space, became uncertain. I would reach for an object and miss by 15 centimeters because my brain's spatial calculation was out of synchronization with my actual arm position. But by the second week, the dissonance began to resolve. My sensory input stabilized, the delays decreased, and then disappeared. By the third week, I could feel the difference. Feel is imprecise. I registered the difference. My thought patterns had changed fundamentally. Information arrived faster, processed more efficiently, with less cognitive load than before augmentation. I could hold multiple complex datasets in working memory simultaneously, without experiencing the confusion or overwhelm that had occasionally occurred during training simulations. Numbers that would have required conscious effort to maintain previously now simply persisted in my awareness, available for immediate access. And emotional responses felt distant, muffled, as though occurring to someone else whose experiences I was observing through monitoring equipment. When the Medicaid staff informed me that one of my training cohort had died during his augmentation procedure, neural rejection, catastrophic interface failure, brain death within 40 minutes of installation, I registered the information with clinical detachment. I had known him. We had worked adjacent stations during simulations. His name was Petron, I think, or something similar. But his death produced no grief, no distress, only acknowledgement that outcomes varied, and some percentage of augmentation procedures resulted in termination of the subject. This was optimal, according to the Medicaid technician who performed my final evaluation. He said the chemical regulation was functioning perfectly, that my neural integration showed no signs of rejection or psychological degradation, that my emotional dampening was within ideal parameters. He marked me for immediate deployment and said I should be proud of adapting so successfully to augmentation. I noted his statement without particular response. Pride remained a concept I could acknowledge intellectually, but not experience directly. But I understood what he was actually communicating. That I had been successfully converted into the kind of component the Imperium required, that the person who had entered the augmentation procedure was functionally gone, replaced by something that could process human suffering as system data. They assigned me to the Eternal Prosecution, a dictator-class cruiser operating in the Gothic sector. The ship was old, commissioned 4 centuries before my birth, according to the service records I accessed, but it had been maintained according to Mechanicus protocols and remained fully operational. I reported to the systems monitoring bay 7 days after my augmentation recovery certification. The transit from training facility to ship assignment took 4 days aboard a supply transport. I spent most of that time reviewing technical documentation for dictator-class systems architecture, familiarizing myself with the specific configuration and capabilities I would be monitoring. The Eternal Prosecution was massive. I knew the specifications intellectually. 1.6 kilometers in length, crew complement of 15,000, armament including multiple weapons batteries and torpedo tubes, capable of sustained void operations for years without resupply, but experiencing the actual scale of the vessel was different from processing numerical data. The supply transport docked at one of the lower cargo bays, and I had to transit through 17 decks to reach the monitoring bay. The corridors stretched endlessly, dimly lit by flickering lumens that cast uncertain shadows across walls marked with centuries of wear and repair. Crew members moved through the passages with practiced efficiency, navigating the cramped spaces with an ease that suggested long familiarity. Most moved in silence or spoke in low voices that didn't carry beyond their immediate vicinity. The sound that dominated was mechanical. Ventilation systems, distant machinery, the constant low vibration of the ship's systems transmitted through every surface. Everything smelled like recycled air and machine oil. That same metallic tang I remembered from the Forge world, but more concentrated, more pervasive. On a ship this size, everything was recycled. Air, water, organic waste processed back into usable resources and circulated again through the same systems for decades or centuries. You were breathing air that had passed through 15,000 pairs of lungs, drinking water that had been sweat and waste and tears, consuming nutrient paste synthesized from biological material that had once been crew members who died and were fed back into the resource cycle. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was lost. Everything continued in the eternal circulation of matter through imperial mechanisms designed to extract maximum utility from every molecule. The monitoring bay was located deep in the ship's core structure, 3 decks below the main crew quarters and 2 decks above the primary generatorium. The placement was intentional. Monitoring stations needed to be protected from direct combat damage, situated in sections less likely to be hit by enemy fire or exposed to hull breaches. The bay itself was a long rectangular chamber containing 12 monitoring stations, arranged in 2 rows of 6. Each station consisted of a cogitator terminal, 3 display screens showing real-time sensor data, a neural interface port for direct connection to ship systems, and a basic seat that could be adjusted for extended monitoring shifts. The stations were separated by minimal space, perhaps half a meter between each position, creating an environment of proximity without interaction. Monitors sat close enough to observe each other's displays, but rarely engaged in communication beyond necessary operational coordination. The temperature there stayed at a constant 19 degrees Celsius, cold enough that you could see your breath in the air during the first few minutes of each shift before your body adjusted and heat from the cogitator systems began to accumulate in the enclosed space. The other monitors said you got used to it, that after a few weeks you stopped noticing the cold. I am not certain that was accurate. I think they simply learned to stop acknowledging the discomfort, to process it as background sensation, rather than something requiring active attention. Pain and discomfort became data points, acknowledged and filed without emotional response. I was assigned to atmospheric and pressure monitoring for sectors 4 through 9, roughly 1/3 of the vessel's habitable volume. My station was positioned in the middle of the right-hand row, between a monitor responsible for power distribution and another handling structural integrity sensors. The station that would become my primary operational position for the next several years of my existence. The seat had been configured for my predecessor, a monitor who had been killed 3 weeks earlier during a hull breach that had penetrated deep enough to reach the monitoring bay's deck level. They had not mentioned this during my assignment briefing, but I found the incident report in the station's local logs when I accessed the system for the first time. My supervisor was an older monitor named Talvek, who had served aboard the Eternal Prosecution for 16 years. He had extensive augmentation, far more than my own basic neural interfaces. His entire right arm was mechanical, replaced after an accident, during an engagement years prior. He had additional interface ports running up his neck and across his temples, suggesting multiple system connections beyond standard monitoring capabilities. Both eyes had been replaced with automatic units that glowed faintly in the monitoring bay's dim lighting. When he spoke, his voice had a slight mechanical edge, possibly from respiratory augmentation, or simply from decades of breathing recycled air in monitoring stations. He showed me the station configuration and explained the monitoring protocols specific to the Eternal Prosecution. Basic procedures were identical to my training, but every ship had unique characteristics, older systems that operated slightly outside standard parameters, unofficial protocols that crew had developed over years of operation, quirks in the sensor network that required interpretation. He demonstrated the interface connection process, showing me how to plug the neural cable into my spinal port and initialize the data stream. His movements were efficient, practiced, the actions of someone who had performed the same procedure thousands of times. When I connected for the first time, the sensation was, I lack adequate descriptive language. Expansion. Suddenly I was aware of thousands of spaces simultaneously. I could sense air pressure in Corridor 47 on Deck 6, and temperature variance in Cargo Bay 12, and humidity levels in crew quarters on Deck 8, and oxygen concentration in Maintenance Tunnel 7 Alpha, and a dozen other data points, all at once, all constantly updating in real time. The information streamed into my consciousness, not as visual data on screens, but as direct sensory awareness, as though I had suddenly developed new senses that registered atmospheric conditions across vast distances. I could feel the ship breathing around me, air moving through ventilation systems, pressure differentials as blast doors opened and closed, temperature gradients between heated crew spaces and cold storage areas. It should have been overwhelming. The training simulations had prepared us for multi-stream processing, but the instructors had warned that actual ship integration was more intense than simulation, that the sheer volume of information could be disorienting during initial connection. Some monitors experienced severe integration shock during their first connection, cognitive overload, sensory flooding, psychological distress that required immediate disconnection and extended recovery. But it was not overwhelming. It was clarifying. For the first time since augmentation, I felt. I registered. I operated at full capacity. The neural enhancements, The cognitive accelerators, the chemical regulators that dampened emotional response. All of it suddenly made sense. This was what I had been prepared for. This was my function. Not to exist as a separate biological unit, observing information through screens, but to become part of the ship's sensory apparatus, to directly perceive the vessel's internal state through integrated neural architecture. I was no longer monitoring the ship. I was part of it. Talvek asked if I was experiencing any integration difficulties. I told him no. The connection felt stable, the data streams clear and comprehensible. He observed my station readouts for several minutes, checking the interface metrics that indicated connection quality and processing stability. Then he nodded and said the integration looked clean, that my neural response patterns were well within acceptable parameters. He left me to familiarize myself with the data streams while he returned to his own monitoring duties. I spent the next 6 hours simply observing, learning the patterns. Every ship has a baseline, normal operational parameters that define healthy system function, temperature ranges for different sections, standard pressure levels, expected humidity variance between crew quarters and cargo areas and machinery spaces, normal fluctuation patterns as systems cycle through their operational routines. Monitoring is not about watching individual data points. It is about understanding the patterns, recognizing when something deviates from baseline in ways that indicate developing problems. Sector 4 maintained slightly elevated temperature compared to specifications. The heating systems had been recalibrated decades ago and never returned to original parameters. Sector 6 showed consistent minor pressure variance in the lower decks, a slow leak somewhere in the ventilation network, too small to locate precisely but stable enough that it had been classified as acceptable deviation. Sector 8's humidity levels fluctuated more than other areas. Proximity to water reclamation systems that introduced moisture into the air during processing cycles. These were the ship's individual characteristics, the specific deviations from ideal that defined this particular vessel's operational baseline. Learning them was essential to effective monitoring. A temperature spike that would indicate equipment failure in one sector might be normal variation in another. The other monitors in the bay were similarly augmented, similarly trained, similarly focused on their assigned data streams. We did not speak much during shifts. Communication occurred primarily through the shared data network. When I needed to coordinate with the monitor responsible for power distribution, his name was Harkov, I learned later. I simply flagged the relevant data in the network, and he acknowledged it through his own interface. The exchange took perhaps 2 seconds, far faster and more efficient than verbal communication. Spoken language was reserved for interactions with unaugmented crew, for filing verbal reports to human officers who required information in biological linguistic format. But during rest periods, brief intervals when we disconnected from the neural interfaces to prevent cognitive fatigue, the monitors would occasionally engage in verbal conversation. Not about personal matters. Augmentation and chemical regulation had suppressed most interest in individual history or emotional experience, but about technical observations, unusual sensor readings, interesting system behaviors. I participated in these discussions minimally during my first weeks aboard. I was still learning the ship's characteristics, still establishing my baseline understanding of normal operations. But I listened. I absorbed the accumulated knowledge of monitors who had served aboard the Eternal Prosecution for years, who knew the vessel's quirks and tendencies through extended observation. I met Kalen during my 3rd week aboard the Eternal Prosecution. He was not a monitor. He was an ordinary crewman assigned to maintenance duties in Sector 7. Atmospheric recycler maintenance, specifically. His job was to physically inspect the equipment that my sensors monitored remotely, to perform manual repairs when automated systems failed, to ensure the machinery that kept 15,000 crew members breathing continued to function cycle after cycle, year after year, without catastrophic breakdown. He came to the monitoring bay because there was a pressure anomaly in one of Sector 7's primary air circulators. A minor issue, a seal degradation that was causing a 2% efficiency loss in the system's circulation capacity. Not immediately dangerous, but something that would worsen if left unaddressed. I had flagged it in the maintenance queue 3 hours earlier, noting the gradual pressure decline and projecting that, without intervention, the seal would fail completely within 48 hours. Standard procedure. My sensors detected the anomaly. I logged it in the system. The maintenance schedule algorithm prioritized it based on severity and available crew resources, and maintenance teams responded according to the queue. He arrived to confirm the exact location before he dispatched a repair team. This was also standard procedure. The monitoring systems could identify which circulator was experiencing problems. Unit 7 Gamma 4 in the lower equipment bay. But maintenance crews needed precise location data. Which access panel? Which specific component within the circulator assembly? What tools and replacement parts would be required? Face-to-face confirmation with the monitor who had flagged the issue often provided details that written reports omitted. I showed him the sensor data on my displays. He leaned over my station to examine the readout, and I noticed he smelled like recaf and something else. Cleaning solvent, I think. One of the industrial compounds used for equipment maintenance. Strong chemical scent that cut through the usual machine oil and recycled air smell that dominated the ship. He studied the pressure curve I had logged over the previous 6 hours, tracing the gradual decline with one finger against the screen. His hands were marked with small scars and old chemical burns, the characteristic damage of someone who worked with machinery daily. Then he asked 3 questions about the specific circulator model, the degradation pattern I was observing, and whether I had detected any corresponding issues in adjacent systems that might indicate a broader problem beyond the single failing seal. They were intelligent questions, precise. He understood the systems he maintained, not just the mechanical procedures for replacing components, but the underlying logic of how the equipment functioned and how failures in one part could cascade into broader system degradation. I answered his questions with the relevant data. I showed him the circulator's location in the ship's schematic, provided the component identification codes he would need to requisition the correct replacement seal from supply, and confirmed that adjacent systems showed no anomalous behavior. The failure was isolated to this single unit. He noted everything on his maintenance slate with quick, efficient movements. He thanked me with a brief nod, professional acknowledgement of assistance provided. Then he prepared to leave, turning toward the monitoring bay entrance. He paused, turned back, and said something that was not operationally necessary. "You must see everything that happens on this ship." I processed the statement for approximately 2.4 seconds before responding. The comment had no clear connection to the maintenance issue we had just discussed. I told him that I monitored atmospheric and pressure data for sectors 4 through 9. That was my operational purview, roughly 1/3 of the vessel's habitable volume. I did not see everything. My sensory coverage was limited to specific systems within specific areas. He smiled. I archived the expression, the specific configuration of facial muscles, the slight asymmetry in how his mouth curved more prominently on the left side, the way his eyes maintained direct contact with mine, rather than shifting away as most crew members did when interacting with augmented monitors. Most people found extended eye contact with monitors uncomfortable. Our augmatic ports and distant affect marked us as something other than fully human, and prolonged interaction seemed to unsettle them. Kalen showed no such discomfort. He said, "That's still more than most of us. We only know what's directly in front of us, the specific panel we're opening, the particular component we're replacing. You know what's happening everywhere, at once. Every corridor, every chamber, every piece of equipment in 6 different sectors. That must be strange. I had no response prepared for this observation. It was accurate, but framed in a way that suggested implication beyond the factual content. Strange suggested comparison against a baseline normal experience. I no longer had adequate reference for what constituted normal awareness. My current perceptual state was simply my operational condition. I perceived what the ship's sensors registered within my assigned monitoring area. Whether that was strange or normal seemed like a question that required perspective I no longer possessed. Before I could formulate a reply, he left to dispatch his repair team. His footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the monitoring bay, fading gradually as he moved toward the maintenance section's duty stations. I thought about the interaction for approximately 6 hours afterward. Thought processed. I kept returning to his statement, running it through analytical frameworks, trying to understand why he had framed my function in those terms. It was inefficient. The interaction had concluded. The maintenance issue had been addressed. The information exchange had no operational relevance to my ongoing monitoring duties. Yet my cognitive processes continued to allocate resources to examining it, replaying the exchange, considering possible interpretations and implications. This was unusual. Since augmentation, I had not experienced this kind of persistent cognitive engagement with non-operational content. The chemical regulators were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of inefficient mental activity, to suppress thoughts and reactions that did not serve immediate functional purposes. But I found myself accessing the archived exchange repeatedly. His voice saying, "You must see everything that happens on this ship." The way he had smiled when I corrected his statement, with precise technical limitations of my monitoring coverage. The fact that he had engaged with the philosophical implication of my function, rather than simply collecting the information he needed and departing. This was the beginning, though I did not recognize it as such at the time. Kalen returned 4 days later with another maintenance inquiry. A humidity sensor in Sector 7's lower crew quarters was reporting readings that seemed inconsistent with adjacent sensors. He wanted to verify whether the anomaly was actual environmental variance or simply a failing sensor that needed replacement. I pulled up the comparative data and analyzed the readings across a 6-hour period. The sensor was failing. Its reported values drifted increasingly far from the baseline established by surrounding monitors, showing humidity levels that were physically impossible given the compartment's ventilation configuration and proximity to other monitored spaces. I showed him the degradation curve and confirmed it was hardware failure, not environmental. The sensor needed replacement, but the environmental conditions were normal. He studied the data with the same focused attention I had observed during his first visit, leaning close to the display to examine the specific pattern of deviation. Then he asked how I could distinguish between a failing sensor and an actual environmental problem. It was a good question. Not something most maintenance crew asked. They typically just wanted confirmation of which component needed replacement, but it demonstrated genuine interest in the analytical process rather than just the outcome. I explained that sensor failure typically produced specific patterns, readings that drifted gradually outside possible physical parameters, or values that fluctuated wildly without corresponding changes in adjacent areas, or data that became increasingly inconsistent with other environmental factors that should correlate. Humidity, temperature, and air pressure were interconnected variables. If humidity spiked in a compartment, you would expect corresponding changes in temperature or pressure. When only one variable showed anomalous readings while others remained stable, that indicated sensor malfunction rather than actual environmental change. Actual environmental problems produced different signatures. Multiple sensors registering coordinated changes, readings that remained within physically possible ranges, even if abnormal. patterns that matched known failure modes of the equipment being monitored. A ventilation system breakdown would affect multiple variables simultaneously across connected compartments. A coolant leak would produce temperature changes that propagated through adjacent spaces in predictable patterns. He listened carefully, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was genuinely trying to understand the analytical process, not just collecting information for immediate use. How did I weight different variables when they provided conflicting information? What happened when sensor failures occurred during actual environmental emergencies? How did I maintain confidence in my assessments when the data itself became unreliable? Most crew members who came to the monitoring bay simply wanted the specific information they needed and left as quickly as possible. Augmented monitors made people uncomfortable. The visible interface ports, the distant affect produced by chemical regulation, the fact that we spent entire shifts plugged into the ship's systems, perceiving spaces we never physically entered. It marked us as something other than fully human. Most crew avoided extended interaction, treating us as sophisticated equipment that could answer queries, but not as people worth engaging with beyond operational necessity. Kalen did not seem uncomfortable. He engaged with the technical content as though I was simply another crew member with specialized knowledge, not a semi-mechanical component of the ship's sensor apparatus. He returned 6 days after that with another inquiry about pressure variance in a maintenance tunnel. Then 5 days later with questions about temperature regulation in the Sector 7 equipment bays. Then again, with a request for historical data on atmospheric recycler performance to help predict future maintenance requirements. The intervals were inconsistent with standard maintenance scheduling patterns. I began to suspect he was manufacturing reasons to visit the monitoring bay. I did not report this observation. It seemed irrelevant. His inquiries were always technically valid, even if not strictly necessary. And I found that I processed the interactions with something approaching, I hesitate to apply terminology here, interest. I registered interest in these exchanges. They created brief variations in the otherwise monotonous pattern of monitoring duties. Monitoring was repetitive by nature. The same data streams, the same sensor readings, the same patterns repeating cycle after cycle. Anomalies occurred infrequently enough that most shifts involved simply observing stable systems operating within normal parameters. The work required constant attention. Catastrophic failures could develop rapidly, and early detection was critical. But moment to moment, it was tedious. Watching numbers that rarely changed significantly, waiting for deviations that might not occur for days or weeks. Kalen's visits introduced variation, something different from the endless data streams, a reason to disconnect briefly from the neural interface and engage in verbal communication about topics that extended beyond immediate system status. We began to speak about topics beyond immediate operational requirements. He told me about the Sector 7 maintenance crews, how they operated in teams of 4, rotating through 12-hour shifts, how they had developed informal protocols that were more efficient than the official munitorum procedures. The formal documentation assumed ideal conditions and new equipment, but the eternal prosecution was 4 centuries old. Components had been replaced or modified countless times. Systems had been jury-rigged during emergencies, and the temporary solutions had become permanent. The official maintenance manuals were often useless for actual repairs. So the maintenance crews relied on accumulated practical knowledge passed between shifts and across crew rotations. Senior crew taught new members which procedures from the manuals actually worked and which needed to be modified. They maintained informal documentation, handwritten notes, sketched diagrams, verbal instructions passed down through generations of maintenance personnel. He described how they had mapped every access corridor and service tunnel in Sector 7, creating unofficial route guides that let them reach critical systems faster during emergencies. knowledge that existed nowhere in the official ship schematics but was essential for keeping the aging systems functional. He had been working Sector 7 for 3 years. He knew every access panel, every crawl space, every maintenance junction. He could navigate the service tunnels in complete darkness if necessary, guided purely by memory of distances and turn sequences. He said he liked the work, that it felt meaningful to keep the systems running, to know that every seal he replaced and every filter he cleaned kept people alive, that maintenance was invisible when done well. Nobody noticed the air recyclers until they failed, but that invisibility did not diminish the importance of the function. You kept 15,000 people breathing. That mattered, even if most of them never knew your name or thought about the work you performed. I told him about monitoring work, how we tracked thousands of data points constantly, how patterns emerged from the information streams that let us predict equipment failures before they manifested physically, how we could sometimes identify developing problems days in advance, flagging maintenance requirements before the crew members servicing those systems had any direct indication something was wrong. How the neural interface let us perceive the ship's internal state with a comprehensiveness that no amount of physical inspection could match. I explained that my function was also to keep people alive, though at a different point in the operational chain. Monitors provided early warning. Maintenance crews implemented corrections. Both functions were necessary for sustained void operations. Neither could function effectively without the other. He said we were alike in that way, both maintaining the infrastructure that made life possible in the void, both performing work that remained invisible until something failed catastrophically. I archived that statement. I accessed it frequently during subsequent shifts, examining it from different analytical angles, processing the implication that my function shared essential characteristics with his, despite the radical difference in our augmentation levels and operational methods. The chemical regulators that suppressed emotional response were functioning within normal parameters during this period. I should not have been allocating cognitive resources to analyzing conversational subtext or accessing archived statements for non-operational review, but I was. The monitoring data showed my neurological activity included processing patterns inconsistent with pure task focus. Small deviations, not enough to trigger medical review, but present, measurable. I did not report these deviations. The ship operated on a standard patrol cycle during those early months. We would transit to a designated system, established position, scan for hostile activity, and hold station for 6 to 8 weeks before moving to the next coordinate in our patrol route. Long periods of routine operation, punctuated by brief intervals of intense activity when contacts appeared on Auspex arrays. Most contacts were verified as neutral or non-hostile. Imperial merchant vessels, authorized military traffic, astronomical phenomena that registered as potential threats but resolved into natural stellar activity. The Gothic sector was heavily traveled, despite its strategic instability. Trade continued even in contested regions, because the Imperium's economy required constant resource flow between worlds. But occasionally, contacts were genuine hostiles. I was monitoring the data streams during my 14th week aboard, when we encountered our first significant combat action. A raiding force, 3 light cruisers identified as renegade elements, origins unclear, transponder codes flagged as corrupted or falsified. They engaged us at extreme range while we were stationed at the edge of a system containing a minor Imperial outpost that supported several mining operations on the system's asteroid belt. The engagement lasted 43 minutes, from first weapon discharge to enemy withdrawal. I watched it through my sensors, not visually. I had no access to external visual feed from my monitoring station. The display screens showed internal ship systems, not exterior tactical data. But I observed the engagement through its effects on the vessel's internal conditions. I registered the massive power spike when our primary weapons batteries fired. Energy drawn from the generatorium in tremendous surges that caused brief voltage fluctuations across secondary systems. Lights dimmed momentarily throughout the ship as power was diverted to weapons. I tracked the heat buildup in the plasma conduits as sustained weapons fire heated the infrastructure beyond normal operational temperatures. The conduits were rated for brief surge capacity, but extended firing caused thermal stress that approached safety limits. I flagged the rising temperatures and monitored them continuously, ready to alert damage control if the heat reached critical thresholds. I monitored atmospheric pressure spikes in the crew compartments as shockwaves from impact tremors propagated through the hull structure. Each time an enemy weapon struck our armor, the kinetic energy transferred through the ship's structure, creating compression waves that traveled through the air itself. Crew members in compartments near impact sites experienced rapid pressure changes, not enough to cause injury, but enough to be disorienting, painful on the eardrums. I observed temperature fluctuations in sectors near the outer hull as the void's cold seeped through armor that had been heated by weapon impacts and then exposed to the absolute zero of space. Metal contracted and expanded with the thermal stress, creating structural strain that my sensors registered as minor hull deformation within acceptable parameters. We took 3 hits during the engagement. 2 were superficial armor ablation, minor structural damage, no atmospheric breach. The impacts registered as brief thermal spikes in the outer hull sections and increased vibration in adjacent compartments. Unpleasant for crew in those areas, but not dangerous. The armor had performed as designed, absorbing the energy and preventing penetration to inhabited spaces. The 3rd hit penetrated into an empty cargo bay in Sector 12, outside my direct monitoring area, but visible through shared sensor networks. I watched the atmospheric pressure in that compartment drop from standard to 0 in 8.2 seconds. Emergency bulkheads sealed automatically at the sector boundaries, triggered by the catastrophic pressure loss. The automated systems functioned perfectly. Sensors detected the breach, processing units calculated the optimal containment response. Mechanical actuators drove the bulkhead mechanisms closed, all within 3.1 seconds from initial pressure drop detection. Atmospheric loss was contained to 1 compartment. No casualties. The cargo bay had been empty, no crew present when the impact occurred. I verified this through biosign monitoring, confirming 0 terminated indicators in the affected area. The enemy vessels withdrew after we destroyed one of their escorts with a coordinated lance strike that overwhelmed their void shields and vaporized their primary reactor. The remaining 2 ships disengaged and translated out system, abandoning the engagement. We held position for an additional 6 hours, while damage assessment teams evaluated the hit we had taken, then resumed patrol operations once repairs were confirmed as non-critical. That was when I first understood what my function truly meant. I had been monitoring data streams for 14 weeks. I had tracked thousands of minor anomalies, pressure fluctuations, temperature variances, humidity irregularities, all the small deviations that occurred constantly aboard a vessel this size and this old. All abstract. All numbers and patterns in information architecture. I understood intellectually that these readings represented physical conditions, that pressure loss meant air escaping into vacuum, that temperature spikes indicated thermal damage to hull structures. But intellectual understanding is different from operational recognition. During that engagement, I watched the pressure reading in Cargo Bay 12 drop to 0 in real time. 8.2 seconds. I observed the precise moment when the air that had filled that space ceased to exist in any measurable form, vented into the void through the breach the enemy weapon had torn in our hull. I registered the emergency bulkhead activation, watched the sensors in adjacent compartments show the sharp pressure spike, as moving air slammed against the suddenly closed barriers before equilibrium restored. And I understood that if crew had been present in that cargo bay, if it had been a maintenance area, or a crew corridor, or a weapons battery instead of an empty cargo hold, I would have watched their biosigns terminate during those 8.2 seconds. I would have observed the exact moment each one died, not through visual observation or audio feed, but through the simple cessation of their biological signatures in my monitoring network. Green indicators shifting to red, then to nothing. Next time, the compartment might not be empty. I processed this realization over the following week. I understood intellectually that I was monitoring life support systems, that failure meant death, that my function was to identify problems before they killed people. But now I recognized, operationally, that I was positioned to observe death when it occurred and to ensure it did not spread beyond acceptable parameters. My function was not primarily to prevent casualties. My function was to contain them. Emergency bulkheads existed to seal breaches, but sealing meant dividing the ship into isolated segments. Anyone on the wrong side of the barrier when it closed was sacrificed to preserve everyone else. That was the operational logic. Acceptable losses to prevent catastrophic losses. And I was the one who would monitor where the barriers fell, who would track which compartments retained atmosphere and which did not, who would log the biosigns that terminated and file the casualty reports that documented exactly how many died and where and when. I asked Kalen about it when he next visited the monitoring bay. I described what I had observed during the engagement, not the tactical details, but the atmospheric data, the pressure loss, the emergency containment. I asked how he processed the knowledge that any failure in the systems he maintained would kill people, that every seal he inspected, every component he replaced, every procedure he performed carried life or death consequences if done incorrectly or if he missed a developing problem. He was quiet for longer than usual before responding. He stood near my station, not looking at me, his attention apparently focused on one of the display screens, though I do not think he was actually reading the data scrolling across it. His hands moved restlessly, fingers tapping against his maintenance slate in an unconscious rhythm. Finally, he said that he tried not to think about it in those terms, that if he focused on potential catastrophic failures every time he opened a maintenance panel, he would not be able to function. The weight of responsibility would paralyze him. So instead he focused on the immediate work. Replace this seal, clean that filter, inspect these connections, test this valve. One task after another, each one keeping the system operational for another shift, another day, another month. If he did the work correctly, people stayed alive. That had to be sufficient, because if he thought about all the ways the work could fail, all the possible consequences of a single mistake or oversight, he would freeze completely. And freezing was not acceptable. People depended on him. I asked if that approach was sufficient to manage the operational stress. He said, no, but it was what he had, that every maintenance crew member dealt with the same knowledge, carried the same weight. You learned to function despite it, because the alternative was to stop functioning, and stopping was not acceptable. People depended on you, so you kept working. You performed each task correctly. You followed the procedures. You checked your work. And you tried not to think about what would happen if you failed. I understood his response more clearly than I wished to. We were alike in that way too. Both functioning despite understanding the consequences of failure. Both carrying knowledge that could paralyze if examined too directly. Both executing duties that kept people alive while knowing we could not prevent all deaths, only minimize them. The difference was that my augmentation gave me chemical regulation to suppress the emotional weight. He carried it fully conscious. The ship continued its patrol cycle. Months accumulated. I became more efficient at my function. My processing speed increased as I grew more familiar with the Eternal Prosecution's specific characteristics, the unique deviations and quirks that defined this particular vessel's operational baseline. I learned to predict equipment failures with greater accuracy, identifying the subtle pattern deviations that indicated developing problems hours or days before they became critical. I developed optimization protocols that reduced maintenance requirements by 11% across my monitored sectors. Flagging issues earlier meant repairs could be performed before they became urgent, allowing better scheduling and resource allocation, preventive maintenance rather than emergency response. The efficiency gains were noted in my service record during my 6-month evaluation. Talvik, my supervisor, mentioned that my performance exceeded expectations for monitors at my experience level. Kalen continued to visit the monitoring bay. The intervals remained irregular, but the visits became a constant feature of my operational routine. Sometimes he came with legitimate maintenance inquiries, questions about sensor data, requests for historical performance information, confirmation of equipment locations. Sometimes he simply stopped by during his shift to see if I had flagged any new issues in Sector 7 that his teams should address proactively. We spoke about technical matters, about ship operations, about the peculiar rhythms of life aboard a vessel that spent years in the void between meaningful contacts with Imperial worlds. How time became elastic when measured in patrol cycles rather than planetary rotations. How the crew developed informal traditions and social structures that had little connection to official Imperial hierarchy. How people adapted to living in confined spaces with recycled everything, surrounded by the constant awareness that only thin metal barriers separated them from vacuum and death. Sometimes we did not speak at all. He would simply stand near my station while I worked, observing the data streams with me, occasionally asking what a particular reading meant or how I distinguished between normal variation and developing problems. I found these silent periods did not create discomfort the way silence with other crew members sometimes did. His presence did not require verbal interaction to have meaning. There was something comfortable in simply sharing space with another person who understood the weight of keeping systems functional in the void. I began to anticipate his visits. When his shift schedule placed him in Sector 7 during my monitoring hours, information I accessed through the ship's crew assignment databases, I would allocate a portion of my cognitive processes to noting his movements through the sector. This was technically within my operational duties. Biosign tracking was part of standard monitoring to maintain crew location awareness during emergencies. Knowing where personnel were located at any given time allowed faster emergency response coordination and more accurate damage assessment. But I specifically noted his biosign. I tracked where he was, what systems he was servicing, when his route might bring him through the corridors near the monitoring bay. I registered when he entered my sensor coverage and noted when he departed. I maintained continuous awareness of his location whenever he was present in sectors I monitored. This was inefficient resource allocation. I noted the inefficiency. I did not correct it. During my second year aboard the Eternal Prosecution, I began to experience degradation in what the Medici staff called effective dampening, the chemical regulation system that suppressed emotional responses. The augmentation was not permanent. It required periodic recalibration to maintain effectiveness. Standard procedure called for maintenance every 8 months, scheduled during routine crew medical evaluations. My scheduled recalibration was delayed by 11 weeks due to the ship's patrol assignments. We were operating in a region far from Imperial facilities, equipped to perform augmentation maintenance, and operational requirements prevented us from diverting to appropriate stations for what was classified as non-critical maintenance. Life support monitors, weapon systems, navigation, those took priority over individual crew medical procedures that were not immediately urgent. During that 11-week delay interval, I noticed the distance that had characterized my thought processes since augmentation began to decrease. Emotional responses that had felt muffled and observational, as though belonging to someone else whose experiences I monitored remotely, became more immediate, more direct. I registered increased cognitive resource allocation to non-operational considerations. Thoughts that had nothing to do with monitoring duties or system analysis would intrude during shifts. I would find myself wondering about things that had no relevance to my function. What Kalen was doing when he was not visiting the monitoring bay. Whether he thought about our conversations the way I did, accessing them repeatedly and examining them from multiple angles. What it meant that his visits had become something I actively anticipated rather than simply noting as routine variance in my operational environment. I found myself, the correct term is difficult to select. I found myself feeling things more directly. When Kalen visited the monitoring bay, I experienced something approaching pleasure at his arrival. Not just the abstract acknowledgement that his presence created variation in routine, but actual positive sensation. Warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with compartment temperature or metabolic function. A kind of eagerness in anticipation of the conversation, curiosity about what he might discuss or ask about. When he described a difficult repair he had completed, a corroded coolant junction that had required 3 hours of work in a cramped maintenance tunnel, I felt something resembling satisfaction at his success, vicarious pride in his competence and persistence. When he mentioned that he had requested extended duty assignment in Sector 7 because he preferred the crew there, because the maintenance teams were competent and worked well together, I processed relief that he would remain in an area I monitored, that I would continue to track his biosign through my routine sensor sweeps, that he would continue to have reasons to visit. These responses should have alarmed me. They were clear indicators of chemical regulation failure, evidence that my augmentation was not maintaining the emotional suppression necessary for optimal monitoring function. I should have reported the degradation immediately and requested priority maintenance scheduling. This was standard protocol when augmentation systems failed to maintain optimal parameters. Chemical regulation failure could lead to cognitive instability, compromised decision-making, emotional reactions that interfered with monitoring efficiency. I did not report it. I told myself, I processed the justification, that the degradation was minor and not yet affecting my operational efficiency. My monitoring accuracy remained within acceptable parameters. My response times had not increased. My error rate had not risen. My casualty identification performance was actually above baseline, better than during my first year of service. Therefore, the maintenance could wait until my scheduled recalibration date, whenever the ship's patrol brought us back within range of appropriate facilities. This was rationalization. I recognized it as such even as I constructed the justification. The degradation was affecting my cognition. That was definitionally what effective dampening failure meant. My thought patterns had changed measurably. I was allocating cognitive resources to non-operational considerations with increasing frequency. I was experiencing emotional responses that the chemical regulation was supposed to prevent. But I did not want the maintenance because I did not want to return to the distant, muffled state where emotional responses felt like they belonged to someone else. I experienced desire, clear and immediate. I wanted to continue experiencing the clarity of feeling I had briefly recovered. I wanted to feel pleasure when Kalen visited. I wanted to experience satisfaction in our conversations. I wanted the warmth that spread through my chest when he smiled at something I said. I wanted to feel human again, even though I knew that wanting was itself evidence of system failure. The Medicaid staff discovered the degradation during a routine evaluation 3 weeks later. They ran standard neurological assessments on all augmented crew quarterly to monitor for interface degradation, neural rejection, or augmentation malfunction. The scans showed my chemical regulator output was 23% below optimal levels, well outside acceptable variance. The attending Medicaid reviewed my maintenance history, noted the delayed recalibration, and scheduled immediate corrective procedure. They recalibrated the regulators the following day. The procedure took 40 minutes. I remained conscious throughout, connected to monitoring equipment that tracked the chemical levels as they adjusted the augmentation's output. I felt registered. I observed the emotional clarity diminish in real time. The warmth faded, the anticipation dulled. The pleasure became distant again, muffled, as though happening to someone else whose experiences I was monitoring through remote sensors. The distance returned. The familiar observational detachment that had characterized my thoughts since initial augmentation. Emotions became data again, acknowledged intellectually, but not felt directly. I resumed normal operations with optimal efficiency. My thought patterns stabilized. The intrusive, non-operational considerations decreased to negligible levels. I continued monitoring my assigned sectors with appropriate focus and no degradation in performance metrics. But I retained, archived, the memory of those 11 weeks when I had felt things directly, when emotional response had not been distant observation, but immediate experience. When Kalen's visits had produced warmth and pleasure rather than simply acknowledged variation in routine. I accessed that archive frequently, more frequently than operationally necessary. The memory became a reference point, a measure of something that had been briefly present and then removed. I never told Kalen about the degradation or the recalibration. There was no operational reason to inform him. Our interactions continued as before. He visited the monitoring bay with maintenance inquiries. We discussed technical matters and ship operations. Sometimes we simply shared space in comfortable silence. But I knew something had changed. And I calculated. I knew that if I described the experience, he would recognize what I had only partially acknowledged to myself, even during those 11 weeks of chemical regulation failure. That his visits had become more than efficient information exchange. That I had assigned disproportionate significance to his presence. That somewhere in the processing of data and the execution of function, I had developed something that resembled attachment, connection, perhaps even what unaugmented humans would categorize as friendship, though I had no adequate framework to evaluate that classification. I do not complete that analysis, even now. Some archives are too dangerous to access fully. Some recognitions carry implications that would interfere with function if processed to their logical conclusions. The ship's operational tempo increased during my third year aboard. The Gothic sector was experiencing elevated hostile activity, renegade fleet elements conducting coordinator grades, Xenos forces pushing into Imperial space, areas of spatial anomaly that made warp transit unpredictable and dangerous. Our patrol cycle shortened from 6 to 8 week station holding to 3 to 4 week rotations. We moved constantly, responding to distress signals, reinforcing Imperial positions, engaging hostile forces with increasing frequency. Combat became routine. We participated in 4 major fleet actions and 17 smaller engagements over an 8-month period. Each engagement brought damage, casualties, the familiar pattern of hull breaches and emergency containment, and biosigns terminating while I watched through my sensors. I logged each casualty with appropriate precision. Location, time, atmospheric conditions, survival duration if trapped in sealed compartments. The data accumulated in my casualty archives building a comprehensive record of how crew members died aboard the Eternal Prosecution during sustained combat operations. The first breach that killed crew members in my directly monitored sectors occurred during my 27th month of service, not in Sector 12, where I had observed through shared networks, but in Sector 5. My responsibility, my area of awareness. A torpedo impact on the port side, lower decks. The weapon penetrated through 2 armor layers and detonated inside a crew corridor on Deck 9. I watched the atmospheric pressure in that section drop from standard to 0 in 4.8 seconds. Emergency bulkheads sealed at both ends of the corridor, containing the breach according to design parameters. But 17 crew members had been present in that corridor when the torpedo struck. 17 biosigns in my monitoring network, green indicators showing normal vital signs one moment, and then I watched them terminate. Not simultaneously. The decompression took 4.8 seconds. Some died instantly, positioned near the breach point where the explosion and initial pressure loss killed them, within the first second. Others survived longer, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, as they tried to reach the emergency bulkheads or simply held onto corridor fixtures while the atmosphere tore past them into the void. 17 green indicators shifting to red, then to nothing. I logged the casualty figures and filed the incident report per standard protocol. Location, time, atmospheric loss duration, number of casualties, emergency response time, containment effectiveness. All standard data points documented with appropriate precision. The report was comprehensive, technically accurate, exactly what regulations required. Then I interfaced with the ship's Medicae systems to confirm the identities. That was not strictly my function. Casualty identification was handled by other departments, cross-referenced against crew manifests and duty assignments. But the data was accessible through shared architecture. And I required verification. I needed to confirm that none of the terminated biosigns belonged to Kalen. None did. They were all gunnery crew assigned to weapons batteries in Sector 5. Their duty stations were near the corridor where the torpedo had struck. I had no routine contact with weapons personnel. Their duties did not bring them to the monitoring bay. I had never spoken to any of them, did not know their names before accessing the casualty identification data. I resumed normal monitoring operations. But I allocated increased cognitive resources to tracking Kalen's biosign, not just noting his location during his shifts, but verifying his status every 30 minutes, then every 15 minutes, then continuously as background process. His biosign flagged in my awareness the way critical systems were flagged for priority attention. I knew this was inefficient allocation of resources. I knew the chemical regulation was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of attachment-driven monitoring behavior. I did not correct it. Because I had watched 17 people die in 4.8 seconds, and I understood with absolute operational clarity that it could happen again. That any engagement could produce another breach, another decompression, another sequence of green indicators shifting to red and then to nothing. And I would not fail to notice if one of those indicators was Kalen. The engagements continued. We took damage in 6 of the next 8 combat actions. 4 resulted in atmospheric breaches. 3 produced casualties in sectors I monitored. I logged each one with appropriate documentation. 34 dead in Sector 4 when a macro shell punched through crew quarters during a rest cycle. 11 dead in Sector 8 when explosive decompression threw them against emergency bulkheads with sufficient force to cause fatal trauma before the pressure could equalize. 23 dead in Sector 6 when the bulkhead mechanisms failed, and 3 compartments vented before manual override sealed the breach. The numbers accumulated in my casualty logs. I processed each death as data point. Location, time, cause, biosign termination. I filed the reports and continued monitoring. But I tracked Kalen's location constantly now. Verifying his status had become automated background process, as fundamental to my operation as monitoring atmospheric pressure or temperature regulation. I knew where he was at all times when he was in sectors I monitored. I registered when he entered hazardous areas, maintenance tunnels near the outer hull, equipment bays adjacent to weapons batteries, any location that would be at elevated risk during combat. He visited the monitoring bay less frequently during this period. Maintenance crews were operating on accelerated schedules, performing emergency repairs on damaged systems, conducting intensive inspections on sections adjacent to breach sites. He was working 16-hour shifts, sometimes longer. When he did visit, he looked exhausted. Visible indicators included bloodshot eyes, reduced coordination evident in his movements, slower verbal response time, signs of sustained sleep deprivation, and physical stress. I told him during one visit that his biometric indicators suggested he was operating beyond sustainable stress levels, that he should report to Medikey for evaluation and possible duty reduction. He said the entire maintenance division was operating beyond sustainable levels, that there was too much damage, too many repairs required, insufficient crew to handle the workload, that Medikey was already overwhelmed treating combat injuries and had no resources to address fatigue symptoms that were not immediately life-threatening. He said they would rest when the operational tempo decreased, when the ship returned to safer regions and routine maintenance could resume normal scheduling. Until then, they worked the hours required to keep critical systems functional. I noted his response and did not press the issue further. I understood operational necessity. Sometimes systems had to operate outside optimal parameters, because optimal was not achievable with available resources. But I flagged his biosign with higher priority. I monitored his vital indicators whenever he was in my sensor range. Heart rate, respiratory pattern, movement characteristics that might indicate coordination degradation or attention failure that could lead to accidents. I knew this was not my function. I knew I was allocating disproportionate resources to monitoring one individual among thousands. I did it anyway. The engagement over Thaconia's belt occurred during my 34th month of service. We were part of a small fleet element, 3 cruisers and 5 escorts, intercepting a renegade force that had been raiding Imperial shipping lanes in the belt's asteroid fields. Intelligence had projected enemy strength at 4 to 6 vessels. The actual force was considerably larger, 8 capital ships and numerous support vessels. The engagement became a close-range exchange that lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. Brutal, sustained combat at distances where every weapon system could achieve maximum effectiveness. Both sides taking heavy damage, ships maneuvering desperately to avoid concentrated fire while trying to bring their own weapons to bear. The eternal prosecution took 14 hits during the first hour and 43 minutes of the battle. Most were contained. Armor ablation, minor breaches sealed by emergency systems, damage that was survivable and repairable. I logged each impact, tracked the spreading damage, coordinated with other monitors as failures in their sectors affected systems in mine. The 15th hit was different. A macro shell struck Sector 7 Ghana on the port side, lower decks. I registered the impact through massive kinetic energy transfer that translated into structural disruption across multiple hull layers. Catastrophic pressure loss. Atmospheric pressure in Sector 7 Gamma dropped from standard to 0 in 14.3 seconds. 147 biosigns present in that section when the shell penetrated. I watched them die, not all at once. The evacuation took 14.3 seconds, longer than most breaches because the damage was extensive. Multiple compartments compromised simultaneously, air escaping through several breach points. Some terminated in the first 2 seconds. Crew positioned near the impact sites, who were killed by debris or pulled directly into vacuum. Others lasted longer, 6 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds, as they tried to reach emergency stations or seal interior hatches, or simply held onto fixed structures while the atmosphere tore past them into the void. I tracked every biosign, watched the vital indicators as they spiked and then flatlined, heart rates accelerating as bodies responded to sudden decompression, respiratory rates meaningless, as there was no air to breathe. Movement signatures showing frantic displacement or sudden stillness depending on where they were positioned when the breach occurred. Kalen's biosign was among them. I knew because I had been tracking him constantly. Priority monitoring, continuous verification. His location flagged in my awareness and updated every 0.3 seconds. He was in Sector 7 Ghana, performing maintenance on an atmospheric recycler in the lower equipment bay, the same systems he had been servicing for 3 years, his assigned duty station. When the shell hit, I registered his biosign data in real time, heart rate spiking to 170 beats per minute, as fear and exertion activated his sympathetic nervous system. Respiratory rate increasing uselessly as he attempted to breathe in rapidly thinning atmosphere. Movement indicators showing rapid displacement. He was being pulled toward one of the breach points or attempting to reach an emergency station. I could not determine which from sensor data alone. The movement was chaotic, desperate, the biosign signature of someone fighting for survival. His vital signs terminated at the 11-second mark. Heart rate dropped to 0. Respiratory ceased. Movement stopped. The green indicator that I had monitored continuously for 3 years shifted to red, then to nothing at all. Emergency bulkheads sealed 3.1 seconds later, completing their closure cycle at 14.3 seconds total from initial breach. 109 crew members remained alive on the pressurized side of the barriers. 38 were sealed, on the wrong side, in compartments that had lost atmosphere, in corridors that had vented, trapped in spaces where they could not survive even if they had lived through the initial decompression. I continued monitoring. That was my function. I logged the atmospheric loss data, tracked the pressure readings in adjacent compartments to verify the emergency seals were holding, coordinated with damage control as they assessed the breach extent and determined containment was stable. I filed the casualty report. 147 present, 109 evacuated successfully, 38 casualties, location, time, atmospheric loss duration, emergency response effectiveness, all documented with appropriate precision. Then I sat at my monitoring station, still connected to the ship's neural architecture, still processing thousands of data points across sectors 4 through 9, and I accessed the archived interactions I had preserved. Every conversation I had held with Kalen, every visit to the monitoring bay. His voice saying, "You must see everything that happens on this ship." His observation that we were alike, both maintaining infrastructure that kept people alive. The way he smiled with that slight asymmetry I had carefully documented in visual archives. The chemical regulation prevented full emotional processing, but even through the suppression, I registered loss. Something that had been present was now absent. Someone who had visited regularly would never visit again. A biosign I had tracked continuously for 3 years had terminated, and no amount of monitoring would bring it back. Kalen was dead. Vacuum exposure. Biosign terminated at 11 seconds post-impact. Body location unknown, possibly pulled into void through one of the breach points, possibly present in one of the vented compartments, possibly unrecoverable. I logged his death with the same precision I logged every other casualty. Name, assignment, location, time of termination, cause. The report was comprehensive and technically accurate, but I also created a separate archive, Every interaction we had shared, every conversation, every moment of shared silence, every technical discussion and philosophical observation, flagged for permanent preservation, protected against automatic deletion or data compression, because memory was all that remained. And I understood now, finally, operationally, with absolute clarity, why the chemical regulation existed, why they suppressed emotional response in augmented monitors, why they dampened our capacity for attachment and connection. Because feeling this was not compatible with function. Because you could not watch people die through your senses every day and continue operating if you felt each death as personal loss. Because the weight of accumulated grief would eventually exceed any human's capacity to carry it, augmented or not. You had to process it as data, or you broke. The recovery operations began 6 hours after the engagement concluded. Standard procedure for catastrophic damage. Engineering teams evaluated the breach, determined that Sector 7 Gamma had sustained too much structural damage for repair, and recommended permanent sealing. The compartments would remain vented, the bodies unrecoverable, the section written off as total loss. But 38 crew members had been sealed on the wrong side of the emergency bulkheads, and my casualty log showed only 23 terminated biosigns during the 14.3-second evacuation, which meant 15 were still alive when the bulkheads closed. I tracked them through my sensors. 15 green indicators, flagged as isolated, showing decreased but stable vital signs consistent with emergency oxygen supply usage. They had reached emergency stations or sealed themselves in compartments that retained local life support. They had perhaps 6 hours of air, maybe 8 with careful breathing. Then they would suffocate. I filed a priority report flagging the surviving crew and their precise locations, transmitted to damage control, to engineering coordination, to the officer commanding recovery operations. The response came back 19 minutes later. Notation appended to my report. Casualties acknowledged. Recovery not feasible. Seal and continue. They knew 15 men were alive in the sealed sections. They had decided recovery was not operationally justified. I watched those 15 biosigns degrade over the following 7 hours and 42 minutes. Heart rates gradually increasing as oxygen depleted and carbon dioxide accumulated. Respiratory rates climbing as bodies struggled to extract breathable air from increasingly toxic atmospheres. Movement signatures becoming erratic, then minimal, then ceasing entirely as hypoxia progressed to unconsciousness, and then death. I logged each termination with appropriate timestamp and location data. All 15 indicators eventually shifted from green to red to nothing. Total casualties, 38. Kalen had died at the 11-second mark. He had not been among those who survived to suffocate slowly. This should have been preferable, quick death versus prolonged suffering. But he was still dead, and the distinction seemed meaningless. I exist now in the long continuation. Years have accumulated since Cronia's belt. I remain assigned to the eternal prosecution, monitoring sectors 4 through 9, watching data streams and tracking biosigns, and logging casualties when combat produces breaches. The chemical regulation functions within acceptable parameters. I process deaths as data with appropriate clinical detachment. I file reports with comprehensive precision. My monitoring efficiency remains exemplary. But I archive every casualty. I preserve details beyond operational requirements. I maintain records that no one will access except myself. Because someone must witness. Someone must note that these deaths occurred with specific circumstances in specific locations at specific times. That these were not just statistics, but people who existed and then ceased to exist, while someone observed. I am that observer, the consciousness positioned to watch through sensors as the Imperium consumes the people who keep its machinery functional. I cannot prevent their deaths. I can only document them. But documentation is a form of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is all I have left to provide. The ship continues operating. The patrols continue. More engagements, more damage, more casualties added to the archives I maintain. I watch through my sensors. I track the biosigns. I log the terminations. I preserve the records. I witness. Because that is what I am. What the Imperium made me. A consciousness that observes death with clinical precision, while maintaining just enough archived humanity to recognize what is being lost. The monitoring continues. The casualties accumulate. The archives grow. And 14.3 seconds remains the measure of how long it takes for everything to end.